On the night of December 24, 1863, in a cotton plantation 7 miles west of Charleston, South Carolina, a woman named Hattie walked through the main house with an axe in her hands and methodically ended the lives of 5 white men while they slept. The master of the house, Colonel Edmund Fairweather, 52 years old, died first. Then his 4 sons, aged 16 to 26, died in their beds one after another, in silence broken only by the sound of splitting wood and the creak of old floorboards. By dawn on Christmas morning, the house was soaked in blood, and Hattie was gone. You are now listening to Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal not heroism, but the moral abyss into which an entire society willingly descended. The Fairweather plantation was not among the largest in the Charleston district, but it was respectable. 218 enslaved people worked its fields, producing cotton of middling quality that fetched decent prices in the years before the war made everything uncertain. Colonel Fairweather had inherited the land from his father in 1847 and had run it with the methodical cruelty typical of men who believed themselves stewards of civilization. He was a Presbyterian, a man who read scripture aloud to his family every Sunday evening and who believed that slavery was not merely an economic necessity but a divine institution, a means by which the savage African might be brought closer to Christian salvation through toil and discipline. His wife had died in childbirth in 1851, and since then he had raised his 4 sons alone, with the help of house servants who cooked, cleaned, and obeyed without question. The boys grew up knowing no world but this one, where human beings could be bought and sold like horses, where a man's worth was measured in acres and flesh, and where the word of a white man was law, scripture, and final judgment all at once. Hattie was born on the plantation in 1836. Her mother had been a field hand, her father unknown, though there were whispers that he had been one of the overseers, a white man who took what he wanted and left nothing but a child with lighter skin and green eyes that marked her as different. By the time Hattie was 14, she had been moved from the fields to the main house, where she worked as a kitchen girl under the supervision of an older woman named Dinah, who taught her how to cook the dishes that white families expected, how to move through rooms without being noticed, how to lower her eyes and keep her thoughts hidden behind a mask of obedience. Hattie learned quickly. She was quiet, efficient, and careful never to give offense. The colonel noticed her, as men like him always noticed young women who had no power to refuse them. In the summer of 1853, when Hattie was 17, she became his concubine. He did not ask her permission. He did not need to. She was his property, and he took her as he pleased, in the small room behind the kitchen where she slept on a thin mattress on the floor. For 10 years, Hattie lived in this way. She bore him no children, a fact for which she was privately grateful, though the colonel sometimes expressed disappointment. She cooked his meals, washed his clothes, warmed his bed when he demanded it, and endured the contempt of his sons, who looked at her with a mixture of lust and disgust, knowing what she was to their father and hating her for it even as they desired her themselves. The eldest son, Thomas, 26 years old in 1863, had his father's cold blue eyes and his mother's sharp features. He was studying law before the war began, and he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him deference. The second son, Richard, 23, had enlisted in the Confederate cavalry and returned home in the fall of 1863 with a bullet wound in his thigh that left him limping and bitter. The third son, William, 20, was a sickly boy who spent most of his time reading poetry and coughing into handkerchiefs. The youngest, James, only 16, was the cruelest of them all, a boy who tortured animals for amusement and who had once beaten an elderly enslaved man nearly to death for failing to address him as young master with sufficient respect. The war had changed things on the plantation, though not in the way the enslaved had hoped. Many of the younger men had been conscripted or had volunteered, and the fields were worked now by women, children, and the old. The overseers were harsher than before, as if the fear of losing the war had made them more desperate to assert control. Whippings increased, rations decreased. The colonel grew more irritable, more prone to sudden rages. He drank more whiskey than he once had, and he took out his frustrations on Hattie in ways both physical and psychological. He told her that the Yankees were coming, that they would free the slaves and let them run wild, that chaos would consume the South. He told her that she should be grateful to him, that without him she would be nothing, that he had given her a better life than she deserved. She listened in silence and said nothing. There were 7 other enslaved people who worked in the main house with Hattie. There was old Dinah, 68 years old, who had been born in Virginia and who remembered when the plantation had been smaller, when the old colonel, Edmund's father, had been alive. There was Moses, a man of 50 with a scarred back and a quiet dignity, who tended the horses and kept the stables. There was Clara, 32, a seamstress who mended the family's clothes and who sang hymns while she worked. There was Samuel, 45, the butler, a man who moved through the house like a shadow, always present but never intrusive. There was Ezra, 19, who worked in the garden and who dreamed of running away to join the Union Army. There was Lily, 24, who cared for the colonel's hunting dogs and who had lost 2 children to fever. And there was Jonah, 16, a boy who had been bought from a neighboring plantation just the year before and who was still learning the rhythms of life at Fairweather Hall. These people knew Hattie, they knew what the colonel did to her, they pitied her, and they feared for her, and they said nothing, because there was nothing they could say that would change anything. In the autumn of 1863, something broke inside Hattie. Perhaps it was the news of the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the growing sense that the Confederacy was losing the war, and that the old order might truly be coming to an end. Perhaps it was the night Richard, drunk and furious about his wounded leg, cornered her in the hallway, and told her that when his father died, she would belong to him, and that he would make her regret every moment she had ever lived. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of years, the unbearable weight of being owned, of being used, of being treated as less than human by people who prayed to the same God she prayed to, and who claimed to be her superiors in all things. Whatever the reason, Hattie decided that she would not live this way any longer. She did not decide to run. She had nowhere to run to, no safe place, no promise of freedom that was anything more than a rumor. She decided, instead, that she would make them pay. She would destroy the men who had destroyed her. She would take from them what they had taken from her, everything. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. In a society where human beings were property, where the law protected the master and condemned the slave, where even the churches preached that submission was a virtue and resistance a sin, what options did a woman like Hattie have? She could endure, and many did. She could run, and some tried, though most were caught and punished with savage cruelty. Or she could strike back, knowing that it would cost her everything, but that at least she would die on her own terms, having taken something from those who had taken everything from her. This is not a story of justice. Justice did not exist in the world Hattie inhabited. This is a story of what happens when the human spirit is pushed beyond the limits of what it can bear, when the only choice left is between annihilation and revenge. Hattie began to plan in secret. She watched the routines of the house, noted when the colonel and his sons went to bed, observed where the axe was kept in the woodshed behind the kitchen. She spoke to no one about her intentions, not even to Dinah or Moses, though she suspected they might have understood if she had. She chose Christmas Eve deliberately. It was a night when the white family would be relaxed, full of food and drink, their guard down. It was a night when the enslaved would be in their quarters, exhausted from preparing the holiday meal, unlikely to be wandering the grounds. It was a night when the rest of the world would be celebrating the birth of the Prince of Peace, while Hattie would be committing an act of violence so shocking that it would be remembered for generations. On the afternoon of December 24th, Hattie prepared the Christmas Eve supper as she always did. She roasted a goose, baked sweet potatoes, made cornbread and gravy. She set the table in the dining room, with the good china and the silver candlesticks. The colonel and his sons ate well that night, drank whiskey and wine, talked about the war and the Yankees, and what they would do when the Confederacy won, though their voices lacked conviction. Hattie served them in silence, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving through the room like a ghost. When the meal was over, the men retired to the parlor to smoke cigars. Hattie cleaned the kitchen, washed the dishes, and waited. Around 11 o'clock, the house grew quiet. The colonel and his sons went upstairs to their bedrooms. Hattie waited another hour, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of wind in the trees outside. At midnight, she went to the woodshed and took the axe. It was heavy, meant for splitting logs, with a long handle and a blade that had been sharpened recently. She carried it back to the house, entered through the kitchen door, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She had made her decision, and she would not turn back now. The colonel's bedroom was at the end of the hallway. She opened the door quietly and stepped inside. He was asleep, lying on his back, snoring softly. She stood beside the bed for a moment, looking down at him. This was the man who had owned her, who had used her, who had treated her as a thing, rather than a person. She raised the axe and brought it down. If you want to continue receiving stories like this, stories that confront the darkest chapters of our history with honesty and without flinching, please consider subscribing to Shadows of the South. These are not easy stories to tell, and they are not easy stories to hear, but they are necessary. They remind us of what happens when one group of people is given absolute power over another, and they challenge us to reckon with the legacy of that power in our own time. The colonel died quickly, though not silently. Hattie struck him 3 times, the first blow to the chest, the second to the neck, the third to the head. Blood sprayed across the bed, the walls, her dress. She did not pause. She left his room and moved to the next bedroom, where Thomas slept. He woke as she entered, sat up in bed, his eyes wide with shock. He opened his mouth to scream, but she swung the axe before he could make a sound. The blade caught him in the shoulder, and he fell back against the pillows, gasping. She struck him again, and again, until he stopped moving. The third room belonged to Richard. He was harder to kill. The war had made him alert, and he heard her coming. He tried to get out of bed, tried to reach for the pistol he kept on the nightstand, but she was faster. The axe caught him in the side, and he fell to the floor, clutching the wound. She stood over him, and finished what she had started. William, in the fourth room, woke briefly, and called out for his father, but Hattie did not answer. She killed him as she had killed the others, with the cold efficiency of someone who had been pushed past the point of mercy. The youngest, James, never woke at all. She killed him in his sleep, and when it was done, she stood in his room for a moment, breathing hard, covered in blood, the axe still in her hands. The house was silent now, except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway, and the sound of her own breathing. Hattie walked downstairs, set the axe on the kitchen table, and washed her hands in the basin by the sink. She did not try to hide what she had done. She did not change out of her bloody dress. She simply walked out of the house, across the yard, past the quarters where the other enslaved people were sleeping, and into the night. She followed the road that led away from the plantation, toward Charleston, toward the Union lines that were said to be somewhere to the north. She did not know if she would make it. She did not know if she would be caught, brought back, hanged or burned alive for what she had done. She only knew that she was free now, in a way she had never been before, and that whatever happened next, she had taken back a piece of her humanity from the men who had tried to steal it. By dawn, the bodies were discovered. Dinah, coming to the house to begin preparing breakfast, found the colonel in his bed and screamed. Samuel ran to fetch the overseer, who rode into Charleston to alert the authorities. By midday, the plantation was swarming with white men, armed and furious, demanding to know who had done this, and where they had gone. The enslaved people were questioned, one by one, but no one said anything. No one admitted to knowing where Hattie was, or why she might have done such a thing, though of course they all knew. The white men searched the quarters, the fields, the woods around the plantation. They brought in dogs to track her scent. They questioned neighbors, searched barns and sheds and abandoned buildings. But Hattie was gone, vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Confederacy, into a world where the old certainties were crumbling, and new possibilities, however fragile, were beginning to emerge. Reflect on this for a moment. What kind of society creates a woman like Hattie? What kind of system drives a human being to such an act of desperate violence? The answer is not complicated. It is a society built on the principle that some people are inherently superior to others, that some lives matter, and others do not, that power is its own justification, and brutality, its own reward. The men Hattie killed were not monsters in the conventional sense. They were not uniquely evil, they were simply products of their time and place, raised to believe that owning other human beings was their birthright, that domination was a virtue, that the suffering they inflicted was ordained by God and sanctioned by law. And yet they were monsters, in the way that ordinary people become monstrous when they are given absolute power and taught that there will be no consequences for how they use it. The aftermath of the killings sent shockwaves through the Charleston district. The white community was terrified, convinced that this was the beginning of a general uprising, that the enslaved population would rise up and slaughter them in their beds. Militias were formed, patrols were increased, enslaved people were subjected to even harsher scrutiny and control, as if the solution to one woman's act of violence was to tighten the chains on everyone else. The Fairweather plantation was sold at auction in the spring of 1864. The enslaved people dispersed to other plantations, the main house left to decay. No one wanted to live there. It was said to be haunted, cursed by the blood that had been spilled on that Christmas Eve. Local ministers preached sermons about the dangers of leniency, the necessity of firm discipline, the wickedness of the African race. They did not preach about the wickedness of slavery itself, about the violence inherent in owning another human being, about the moral rot at the heart of their society. They could not see it, or they refused to see it, because to acknowledge it would have been to acknowledge their own complicity in a system that dehumanized everyone it touched. Hattie was never found. There were reports, in the months and years that followed, of a woman matching her description, seen in various places, in Charleston itself, in Columbia, in the camps of the Union Army. Some said she had made it north, that she had found refuge among the freed people who were beginning to build new lives in the ruins of the Confederacy. Others said she had died on the road, caught by patrols or killed by dogs, or simply overcome by exhaustion and exposure. There is no record of her trial, no record of her execution, no grave with her name on it. She disappeared into history, one more unnamed victim of a system that ground up human lives and discarded them without a second thought. But her story survived, passed down through the generations of black families who remembered her not as a murderer, but as a woman who had refused to accept her own destruction, who had fought back in the only way available to her, who had asserted her humanity in the face of a world that denied it. The legacy of that night in 1863 is complicated. On the one hand, it is a story of horror, of violence begetting violence, of the terrible consequences of a society built on cruelty and exploitation. On the other hand, it is a story of resistance, of a woman who refused to be broken, who chose to die on her feet rather than live on her knees. It is a reminder that the enslaved were not passive victims, that they did not accept their bondage with resignation, that they fought back in countless ways, large and small, visible and invisible. Some fought by running away, some fought by slowing their work, by breaking tools, by feigning illness, some fought by preserving their families, their cultures, their dignity, in the face of relentless assault. And some, like Hattie, fought by striking back at their oppressors with a violence that mirrored the violence that had been inflicted on them. It is easy, from the comfort of our own time, to judge Hattie's actions, to condemn her for taking 5 lives on Christmas Eve. It is easy to say that violence is never the answer, that there must have been another way, that she should have endured, should have waited for the war to end, and freedom to come. But we do not have the right to judge her. We did not live in her skin, did not endure what she endured, did not face the choice she faced. The men she killed had spent their lives inflicting violence on her, and on hundreds of other enslaved people. They had raped, beaten, and humiliated human beings with impunity, secure in the knowledge that the law would never hold them accountable, that society would applaud them for maintaining order and discipline. Hattie did not kill them because she was evil. She killed them because she had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, because the system that enslaved her had left her no other way to assert her humanity, to reclaim her agency, to say, in the only language that system understood, that she was a person, not a thing, and that she would not be used and discarded without consequence. The other enslaved people, on the Fairweather plantation, never spoke publicly about what happened that night. They carried the memory in silence, shared it in whispers, passed it down to their children and grandchildren, as a story of both tragedy and triumph. They knew that Hattie had done what they had all dreamed of doing, that she had struck back at the men who had made their lives unbearable, that she had paid the price for her defiance, but had also tasted a freedom that none of them would know until the war ended and emancipation came. They mourned her, and they honored her, and they understood that her story was their story, that her rage was their rage, that her refusal to submit was a refusal that lived in all of them, even if they could not always express it so violently. Consider what it means that this story has been forgotten, or rather, that it has been deliberately erased from the historical record. There are no monuments to Hattie, no plaques marking the site of the Fairweather plantation, no acknowledgement in the histories of Charleston that such an event ever occurred. The white community that lived through that time chose to bury the story, to pretend it never happened, to deny the rage and desperation that simmered beneath the surface of their supposedly ordered and civilized society. They preferred to remember the antebellum South as a place of grace and elegance, of magnolias and moonlight, of happy slaves singing in the fields. They could not bear to remember the truth, which was that the South was built on a foundation of unspeakable cruelty, that its wealth was extracted from the bodies of enslaved people, that its culture was a thin veneer of refinement over a core of barbarism. And so they forgot Hattie, or tried to, because to remember her was to remember everything they had done, everything they had been, everything they had lost, when the Confederacy fell, and the world they had built came crashing down. But we remember her now. We tell her story not to glorify violence, but to bear witness to the truth of slavery, to acknowledge the full humanity of the people who were enslaved, to recognize that they were not content to be property, that they resisted, that they fought, that they suffered and endured, and sometimes struck back with a fury that was entirely justified by the horrors inflicted upon them. We tell her story to remind ourselves that systems of oppression do not collapse on their own, that they must be resisted, that sometimes that resistance takes forms that are uncomfortable and disturbing and violent, and that those forms are not the fault of the oppressed, but of the oppressors who created the conditions that made such resistance necessary. The story of Hattie, of Charleston, is not a comfortable story. It is not a story with a happy ending, not a story that makes us feel good about ourselves or our history. It is a story of pain and rage and desperation, a story of what happens when human beings are treated as less than human for so long that they finally break, and when they break, they do so catastrophically. It is a story that challenges us to confront the darkest chapters of our past, to acknowledge the full extent of the evil that was slavery, to recognize that the legacy of that evil is still with us, shaping our society, our politics, our sense of who we are and who we want to be. It is a story that demands that we do better, that we build a society where no one is treated as property, where no one is subjected to the kind of systematic dehumanization that drove Hattie to pick up an axe on Christmas Eve and end 5 lives, because it was the only way she could reclaim her own. These stories reveal the moral cost of power and the silence that the South preferred to forget. They remind us that history is not a series of abstract events, but a record of human choices, human actions, human suffering. They challenge us to ask ourselves what we would have done in Hattie's place, and they force us to acknowledge that we cannot know, because we have never faced what she faced, never endured what she endured, never been pushed to the edge of that abyss. All we can do is remember her, honor her memory, and commit ourselves to ensuring that no one ever has to make the choice she made again. If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think or feel or question, please leave a comment below, sharing your reflections on this chapter of history and its continued relevance today. These are stories that must be told and remembered and reckoned with if we are ever to move beyond the legacy of slavery and build a more just and humane world.